Hi everyone! In this and the next video I would like to talk about human rights critiques. In this first one I'll say a few general things and actually also introduce three books and works that have been very influential as critiques of human rights. And in the second clip I will then move to the Marxist critique, which of course was addressed in the reading question. Now it's probably best to start by saying that we have already encountered human rights critiques, so to say. Whether these are criticisms of particular institutions and courts, and obviously when talking about the regional and the UN system, we were quite critical on how they function and what their shortcomings are. Whether that is about social and economic rights kind of having second rank often to civil and political rights and what this entails in terms of, in particular, global inequality, or more generally about the implementation that human rights receive in domestic systems. And of course we looked at the UN system, but we also talked about the COVID crisis. This kind of critique of the enforcement or implementation gap, as it is often called, is perhaps even the most popular or widespread one. That being said, what differentiates these kinds of critiques from the one that we are addressing this week is that they do operate within the human rights framework. So they are basically human rights proponents identifying shortcomings and suggesting ways for improvement. The critiques that I'm addressing here and in the next clip, as well as the ones that were talked about in the book, are more fundamental. They really point to kind of innate or structural shortcomings within the human rights framework, which of course is a much more far-reaching and fundamental sort of opposition or objection. And what you will have noticed reading the textbook is that there is of course a great variety of critiques that Marie-Bénédicte Dembour in the chapter actually summarizes pretty well, I think. But they do make very different points. They come at the question of human rights from very different angles. So it's a bit difficult, in fact, to maintain a sort of general overview. What I therefore want to do in this first clip is actually not to take a step back, but rather, and that's not what I usually do in these clips, but in this case more zoom in on three specific works that have been very influential also because their points have been relatively well argued and are memorable, so to say. So they might actually help you remember the criticisms better than you would looking just at the chapter. For this purpose I use books from my own library, and the first one is this one. It's Human Rights by Makau, Mutua, a political and cultural critique. And the book is also cited in quite some length in the chapter, and it is arguably the most forceful or at least most popular representation of the post-colonial critique to human rights, or as it is sometimes called, a third world approach to international law, a TWAIL approach to human rights. So what Mutua does in this book is to ask the very important question to what extent human rights law, but also human rights practices, the discourse of human rights, is in fact tied to a tradition of Western imperialism in which values and of course norms are just imposed from the more powerful West, global North, onto the global South, even in a period following decolonization. And he makes this claim by developing this very strong image, which is this metaphor of the savages, the victims, and the saviors. And what he says is that often when human rights operate in the field, particularly in the global South, what you have is actually a kind of pattern of actors, a kind of cliche or stereotype that reinforces this racial and imperial inequalities. And this starts by having a sort of savage, some sort of either warlord or very violent actor, usually someone of color, victimizing indeed the victims in this particular state, whether that's in a context of armed conflict or in a context of civil war. And then what is presumed is that there would be a savior, and the savior usually is some sort of actor from the global north, a white humanitarian who comes in and rescues the victim from the hands of the savage. And according to Mutua, it is this implicit conception of how human rights work that is actually sustaining and reproducing what we used to regard simply as colonial patterns. It's a very powerful critique, obviously also a very controversial one, but it has definitely made its mark on the human rights literature as a whole. Yet another very different critique comes from this second work, which is Samuel Moyn's The Last Utopia. And it is mentioned, of course, at the beginning of the chapter, but we also encountered it at the beginning of the course. And what Moyn argues here in the first instance is, and that's why we mentioned it back then, is that human rights as a discourse emerged in the 1970s. And more specifically, it emerged because it became a sort of placeholder or replacement for the major ideologies, most notably, of course, communism, but to some extent also, of course, the kind of capitalist or liberal framework. It came to replace them in the ideological foothold as a sort of non-political, more legal ideology, as Moyn argues. And it being an ideology means, of course, that it is inherently political, and that it does, and this is the critical point that he's making, that it kind of prioritizes certain ills or certain issues over others. And most notably, it does not put an emphasis on global economic inequality, which is an argument that Moyn develops more specifically or in greater detail in his second book, which is called Not Enough. I'll briefly get back to this point in the second video when I discuss in more detail the Marxist critique, which of course to some extent is very similar even if it comes from a different historical context. And finally, as a third instance of a human rights critique, and this is the most recent of the three, is Michael Ignatieff's The Ordinary Virtues, which is a very interesting book and a very interesting criticism, because Michael Ignatieff used to be a strong proponent of human rights himself until, and this is what he explains in the book, he came to travel the world and noticed that he doesn't actually encounter human rights anywhere, really. It sounds a little bit cliche or a little bit corny to go into various places from Japan to Bosnia and then not find human rights there. However, he does make a very interesting argument, which is that there are other concepts, other ways of speaking about emancipation that are probably more prominent or more promising, as he says. And these are concepts such as trust, forgiveness, reconciliation, resilience, all of which are actually mentioned and elaborated in this book. And of course, it is a very relevant question to ask whether human rights really is the only way in which we can make the world a better place. Now, all three of those are obviously books, so I summarized them in rather crude terms, and in fact there are only 3 books of a whole library of human rights critiques that is out there. I still hope that you got a glimpse into the variety of human rights criticisms that there are. Also that you might perhaps use those in your final papers. And I now, before moving on to the Marxist critique, want to very briefly draw your attention to another highly influential article, and I'll just flag it here, that summarizes or basically gives an overview of all human rights criticisms basically that there are, at least as arguments, and that is David Kennedy's very famous 2002 article, The Human Rights Movement, Part of the Problem. You will also find the link in the notes, and this finishes the first clip. I will now move on to the second one.